Security transition is well underway in Afghanistan, and by the end of 2014 we will expect that the Afghans will have security lead for the whole country. Meanwhile, what is little understood or little known is the Afghans' plan for the long-term governance and development for their country. A plan that will lead to a self-sustaining Afghanistan. So the next 10 minutes we want to discuss that plan, because whatever we do in security, it's always in the context of the bigger strategic plan for the development of Afghanistan. So, essentially, the first thing that we have to understand is what's happening in 2012. In 2012, the amount of money it costs to run Afghanistan is $4.9 billion. Out of that $4.9 billion, only $1.7 billion is actually raised through internal revenue collection. Well, the rest of that money comes from what we call external assistance. In other words, some 40 donors from around the world that give money to Afghanistan on budget money that goes through the Afghan fiscal systems to help run their country in 2012. This does not create a country that is self-sustaining. It's a country that really relies 70% of the amount to run its country. It relies on the rest of the world. This is something that the Afghans would like to change. The Afghans' long-term plan, economic development plan, is to reach a situation in 2025, 2030, where they don't have to rely so heavily on external assistance for the budget for their country. And so this is the aspiration of where they would like to be in the next 10 to 18 years. So in 2025, currently their goal is that they would only rely on external assistance. It would be 15% instead of 70%. In 2030, they would try to cut it down to 10% reliance on external assistance. So the way they're going to do that is through a strategy, and at the top of that strategy is the Afghan National Development Strategy, which has been around probably for about the last 5 or 6 years. And underneath that, they'll have a much more operational strategy called the National Priority Programs. And there are 22 of them. And these are nested within the larger Afghan National Development Strategy. And the idea is that these will be an operational, practical way that over the next 10 to 18 years that they can reach this economic target. The process by which they have identified the way to change the situation is called the Kabul process. When 3 very important things were identified and agreed between the Afghans and the international community. Under the Kabul process, as we've discussed, they came up with the idea to create 22 national priority programs, which would be much more sort of operational and much more specific in the types of development programs that they wanted. And they felt that if they could implement these 3-year rolling plans, it would help them increase economic development, or economic capability, help build human capital, it would improve the educational system, and this would be the roadmap, therefore, to reach their long-term goal in 2030. So the NPPs have become a centerpiece of the economic and development strategy. And along with that, one of the most important things here is that in the provinces there is a provincial development plan, but that's being developed in a vacuum. Currently, that plan is not aligned to the NPPs. One of the goals in the next few years is try to get provincial officials to align their provincial development plan so that it's nested with all these strategic development plans. And in this way, the donor communities are able to put their money against a streamlined, nested development plan. The 22 national priority programs, or plans, if you like, as we've discussed, are operational plans. And one of the key things to know is it's not one ministry, one plan. These are cross-cutting plans, and they're organized along the lines of 6 clusters. So we have 22 national priority plans, and all of them, if you took a look at them, you would see in the annex of every plan there's a list of projects and programs. For example, in the Education for All NPP, there's a whole list of schools that the Ministry of Education would like to develop. And the question is, how do you resource those kinds of projects? And the answer is that it's resourced through the annual Afghan budget cycle. This is the budget cycle. Every country has a budget. Every country has a budget cycle. And Afghanistan is the same, just like any other country. The budget cycle in Afghanistan begins on December 21st, and it ends after a full year on December 20th. The budget ends when the president signs it in December. Okay, so how does that budget cycle work? Well, just very briefly, in the first few months of the year, the Afghan ministries are asked to formulate their budgets. Every ministry formulates their budgets, and they use the strategic development plans, the 22 NPPs, to inform that budget and to help them prioritize where they would like to put their money for that year. And so this is an extremely important point that they're linking resourcing with a strategic development plan. Once those plans are formulated, once those budgets are formulated in Kabul, and with probably some input from the province informally, the budgets are then reviewed by the budget committees in Kabul. And eventually they are approved by Parliament, and then finally the President, and the Cabinet too, has a look at them. And then eventually the President signs the budget, and the budget is dispersed, and it's dispersed down to the provinces to pay not only for the projects in the 22 NPPs, but also things like O&M and salaries for government officials. So we've talked about the 22 national priority programs. We've described it as a roadmap towards an economically self-sustaining Afghanistan. And if you looked at the 22 national priority programs, which you can do, there is a website called the Kabul Process. You'll see that there are many hundreds of different projects and programs that are all designed to create jobs, to increase human capacity, to develop different industries, to build roads, to help agriculture, and this is all part of a development plan and a governance plan towards reaching the goal of a self-sustaining Afghanistan. But on top of that, there's just one more thing that I wanted to point out, which is important, is that over and above the 22 national priority programs, the Afghans have articulated that their strategy for decreasing spending and increasing revenue collection is based on some very important tenets. The first one is that they really want to improve their extractive industry. They believe that they can really, if they develop this, this is a huge source of internal revenue collection. The next thing is that they really do want to improve their tax collection system. So as businesses grow, as people get jobs, they can start paying taxes and contributing to internal revenue collection. Similar idea with tariffs, cross-border tariffs. But there's one area that is extremely important, has so many implications, is that not only when you're trying to reach an ambitious economic goal, not only do you have to increase your revenue collection, you also have to cut spending. And one of the areas the Afghans are planning on cutting their spending is by reducing their Afghan National Security Forces. The force currently stands at 325,000. It is extremely expensive, several $1 billion a year to run the security forces, most of which comes from the international community. And the Afghans have committed to reducing the size of the military and the police down to about 175,000, which will significantly cut costs. Now, the implication of this is that as the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense complete their budget cycle every year and formulate their budgets, they are really going to have to be cognizant of creating a budget that is effective and much more streamlined for a much smaller, more efficient national security force. And finally, I think we've come to the end of this discussion, finally, one paper that might be useful to read to try to understand this, as we've really only touched on it, the highlights of these concepts, is that the Afghan government has written a paper, a strategy paper. It's called Towards a Self-Sustaining Afghanistan, written in November 2011, endorsed by the JCMB, and it is a narrative, a strategic plan, outlays their plan to reach their economic goals for Afghanistan.